Hello everyone, this is ShortHop, and today I'm going to be providing some commentary on the first album I made back in 2019, Simplicity. I named it that because when I was putting together the album, I was still in the early phases of music production. And as anyone who's tried to make their own music knows, there's basically an infinite number of ways that you can tweak and change songs as you make them. And I decided that since I barely knew what I was doing when it came to making songs, that I would just try to keep things simple. So Simplicity became the title of one of the tracks, and the title of the album itself. The first track of the album is called Land, but originally the project file for this one was actually just called The Happy One. This is because I basically just booted up the software, wrote the main melody, and thought, yep, this is a very happy song. This ended up being my final project in the electronic dance music production university class that I was taking at the time. This is the class that provided me the little push that I needed to actually start learning how to produce my own songs. Now, I did get a good final mark in that class. I think I got like 98 at the end. Now, I showed this track to people a couple times, including in that class, and they told me that it reminded them of Mario Sunshine music, or just Mario music in general. Now, I later found out that part of the main melody of this track actually very closely matches the melody of the Athletic Theme 2 of Super Mario 3D World. If you listen to them side by side, you'll definitely hear the resemblance. And it makes sense that one of my songs would resemble Mario music. I grew up with Mario music for like my entire life. This is also one of the reasons it was called Land. When people would compare it to Mario music, it made me think of jumping into the air, and after you jump, you land. Now, I wasn't sure what the best way to structure my songs was at the time, so for this track, I have this little middle section that switches the chords and melody to more of a minor key with a new bass line and counter melody. I think a lot of my tracks sort of have a main melody and then some kind of counter melody or complementary melody that comes in alongside it. This was actually because the first project that I did in the electronic dance music production class, it was actually to make a riff, so just a loop, just one riff, and then add on to that riff another riff that would complement it. So that's what a lot of my tracks ended up having in them. So then the minor section ends and it returns back to how it was at the beginning of the track. A lot of my instrument choice for these tracks was basically just what I had available to me through the Ableton Live packs that I had at the time. And so a lot of them will be the orchestral pack instruments, a lot of percussions like the bells, just whatever I could put into MIDI that would sound decent. And a lot of the songs on this track have that MIDI feel. None of the instruments really sound real, and I'm okay with that because, I don't know, it's a good place to start, and I still really like how a lot of these tracks sound, regardless of the fact that none of the instruments really sound like real instruments. And that might be another reason why my music in this album has been compared to video game music, is because video game music also has that MIDI feel in a lot of their tracks. And that sort of brings us to the end of the first track I ever finished. And that's the order of these tracks, actually. It's just the order in which I finished them. So some of the other tracks were actually partially made, or I had melodies of them developed before this one, but this was the first song that I actually considered to be in a finished state, which is why it ended up being the first one on the album. Right at the beginning of this track is this bell line, and when I first wrote it, it was almost a note-for-note match to the guitar riff in the middle of the track Gone by Toby Mac. This is a track that I actually listened to a lot growing up, and I had changed the melody a bit more since then, but this was another example of me basically reusing melodies I had heard before without really realizing where the melodies were coming from. I called this track Time. Now, I called it that because it was the track where I first decided to dive into the details of mixing and mastering a little bit more, and since that process took me a lot of time before I was actually satisfied with the result, I was just like, okay, I'm just gonna name this song Time. An interesting thing to note about my early music production process is it was almost mathematical in a way. Like, I would follow a very strict structure of how I would put things together. I would program every single note and then make sure that they're all following the chords, make sure there's no dissonance. Like, I would never really dive outside the realm of these notes sound really good together, just go with those. And with this track I was really experimenting with fading in and out these rhythmic synth chords, as well as going kind of brazy with the drums during the verse sections. And I think there's kind of a beauty of having absolutely no idea what you're actually doing, but just doing it anyway. And that's sort of what this first album represents for me, is it's just like, I like this, so let's do this. Like, let's have a section of this song that is really just chords playing with a bunch of drums in the background, and then it repeats, but the second time it's more notes in those chords. Like, that's just what that last section was. And then by the time we're back at the chorus here, you notice that the beat is like very similar to what it was during the last song, but maybe with like one more fill than the last song had. It all sort of builds on the previous as my knowledge builds up as I'm making these songs. So then everything starts to come down, and I'm experimenting with automation and changing the EQs on all of these, but the bell section comes in again here. And I like how I return to this bell section, but softly in the background is a counter melody to keep things a little bit more fresh. And so when it builds up, the counter melody is now harmonizing with the bells, and it just comes together really nicely and then builds back into the song itself. But instead of building up and then starting the beat right back up, it builds up to this and then goes back down a little bit into this solo section. And once again, my song structure is still strictly instinctual at this point. I'm really just taking sections and throwing them together in any way that I think flows nicely from one into the next, and I think overall it turned out pretty good. As far as the mixing and mastering work that I started to look into for this song that took me all of that time, the more I looked into it, the more I sort of realized that there aren't any strict rules to it, which of course I didn't like that much because I just wanted strict rules. And so I would look at other people's guides going through mastering their different songs, and the scenario that they used for their songs was always a different one than it was for mine. So I couldn't just directly do everything that they were doing in their guide, and because everything is so variable when it comes to music, and like I said before, you can infinitely tweak any of these things. And so for me, it was mostly just, okay, I just want to make the relative levels of this song relatively high, and I want to equalize it in such a way that works. And so I really actually didn't get that far into mixing and mastering, despite how much time this track actually took. Nylon was another track I composed during my music production class. I wanted to do something kind of electro swing-like, but unlike real electro swing artists who actually know what they're doing, I wasn't working with any samples or anything like that at the time. It was all just purely MIDI within my editor. However, I was a jazz drummer in high school, so I knew a thing or two about how to make some relatively jazzy beats. Not that the beat of this song really counts as jazz. One of my favorite songs to play in high school was Big Noise from Winnetka, because it let me get really creative on the toms. So for this track, I wanted to feature pounding toms similar to the ones at the beginning of Big Noise, but with more of an electronic style. So I came up with this main melody, put all the toms on it, put some chords in the background, put some marimba in there to supplement the chords, and basically just build up the beginning. And for this next section, I started experimenting with some arpeggiators. Now I really like how this middle section turned out, because I do something that I also do in later tracks, which is lead with the counter melody, but then layer the original melody on top, but in the background of the counter melody. So as the beat is fading in here, right there, the original melody comes in, but it's only in the left and right channel of each ear, while the center is still the counter melody. And at this point in the song, it's a lot more 4 on the floor than it is focused on the toms like it was at the beginning. But the toms still come back in here, so it's sort of a mix of both, and it's a little weird, but it's also kind of cool. So the question is, did I succeed at my original goal of creating a electro swing-like track? I'd say no, but what I made was something a little bit different, and it's something that I like, and it's sort of nice in its own different kind of way. And that's how a lot of these projects end up. You start with one vision in mind, but it just goes off in whatever direction it goes, and you just follow it there and then see where you end up. Now, the song is called Nylon, which is a little bit of a weird name for a track. The actual reason why it's called Nylon is because the main instrument of the track was the nylon guitar instrument in Ableton Live, and that's one of the first instruments I ever worked with, and it basically built the backbone of this song, so I was just like, whatever, I'll just name it after this instrument. So the names of my songs in this album, as you can see, have been pretty arbitrary, but I sort of like where they come from. So this track started from the idea of live looping. I was actually introduced to the basic concept of live looping through Mystery Guitar Man videos back in the 2010s. The beginning of this features a wind sound effect that I put in, which is played once without effects, but then the second time it's played with pitch correction to the key of C, and so the melody that the wind ended up playing when I pitch corrected is mirrored by a synth that comes in. I really like how just randomly pitch correcting a random wind sound effect turned into part of the melody for this track. All of the percussion at the beginning of the song was created entirely from objects I had on my cluttered desk at the time. It starts, get this, with the trigger of a GameCube controller, then a plastic container of Dungeons & Dragons dice that I shook like a shaker, then water from a water bottle that I sloshed around, then a clap with my hands, then I hit a wooden part of my desk that sounded like a wood block, then I was tapping an empty can, then I added more noises from the sticks of an Xbox controller, and then the sound of snapping a plastic clip shut was used as a hi-hat later on. The main looping melody of this track was actually one of the first that I wrote out of all of my songs, because of that first assignment that we had in the music production class to write a single riff. So I wrote the melody and counter melody of this song for that project, and later came back and turned it into the entire song. I still find the main riff of this song to be absurdly catchy, and that's why I totally abuse it. Like, I loop it so many times in this song, but I really just wanted to let it sort of ride out, and so I just kept it going. And you can see here the counter melody comes in, and I love how these melodies play. The counter melody is just dancing along with the main melody, and they both just go together. They harmonize and link up in rhythm at some points, but then unlink. I really like it. Then it goes to this section where I used a trumpet and a synth pad at the same time, so the two sort of mix together, and it's kind of trumpet-like, but also very electronic. And then the bass line comes back in, and the percussion, of course, is all over the place. I think I added some bongo or conga sounds at this point. And so this point of the song is where we took that wind melody from the beginning and added this trumpet and synth melody to it. And then the beat comes back in here, and you're really just relaxing. You're just grooving out to this part of the song. So this section loops for a while, and this is another thing that I'll do in a couple different songs is I'll have a section loop, but then some aspect of it will be changing. So in this case, different parts of the percussion are coming in as this trumpet synth section loops. And then the melody comes in quietly in the background and starts to exert itself, but then everything goes down again. And it starts with the counter melody. This is another example of me starting with the counter melody, then bringing the melody back in. So the melody starts to come back in right now, and you can see both of them get highlighted in their own separate sections. This ended up being the longest track in the entire album, and I think it really is just because I chose to loop these sections for so long, and I still like it because with all of the different percussion slowly coming in, slowly coming out in all of these different places, and with that main melody that still never fails to put me into a good mood. It's so catchy. It's it all just sort of works out, and it's still one of my favorite tracks on this album. Even after all of this time, I listen to this and it's just like, yes, my funny, silly track with all the weird percussion and the catchy melody. I think I shall partake. So then for the very end of this song, it goes back to the trumpet part, and I actually bring back in the wind sound effect, and the percussion slowly starts to drop off one by one, each different instrument starts to just cut off. Now, actually, the reason I named this track Out was because since I added sounds of wind and water, it reminded me of being outside in nature. So I wanted to just call it Out, because it's about being out when you're not in anymore. You're out and you're in nature and it's windy and there's water and it's great. So the interesting thing about Simplicity is that I wrote Simplicity while working at a sandwich shop, and most of it I wrote just in my head and kept repeating to myself over and over so I wouldn't forget until I got off my shift and could actually write it down. So unlike previous tracks where I had accidentally used melodies that I had heard in the past, for this one I actually purposefully took bits and pieces of other melodies that I knew and on purpose tried to fit them together to make something new. For example, the second part of the chorus you're hearing right now comes from a section of the track Ninjas Like Pie 2 from the kids show, The Backyardigans. I loved The Backyardigans growing up. They were fantastic. The first few notes of this verse comes from the melody of a song I heard in elementary school French class called Comment y aller, which was a kid's song, I think, about just different ways of getting someplace. There was like an alien in it at some point. I don't know. Another focus that I had with this track was with the percussion. I was always a fan of a specific kind of percussion I had heard in various other songs, but I could never actually find the name of the instrument, and to this day, I still don't know exactly what it's called. I think examples of songs with this percussion would be Conqueror by Aurora has it. But yeah, it's sort of a tribal stick percussion, and so that comes in right away in this upcoming section here. So I ended up coming up with something that I thought sounded pretty similar, but I still don't know the proper name for the instrument that I'm even talking about right now. Like, I used timbales in order to get the percussion for this song, but the percussion that I'm thinking of has a lot more stick hits, like intermingled with all of it. It's something tribal. I'm really still not sure. So then what comes up in this next section is a guitar part that does octaves. Now, whenever you hear anything echoey that does octaves, it's likely inspired by the soundtrack of an iPhone app that I played years ago called Aerox, Aerox. It was a simple tilt-controlled 3D marble platformer, but the soundtrack of it was extremely atmospheric, and one of the things that it had was like these octave-jumping, echoey lines. That's also where that descending line that I have playing right now comes from. So the structure of this song ended up being intro, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus. Now I remember I had the verse and chorus sections written, but I didn't want to repeat them too much, just over and over, so I wrote this bridge that would transition into the verse, because the verse transitioned well into the chorus. I also really like how sections of this song start off with a slower kick pattern, then transition into the 4/4 kick. It really just jacks up the energy during those sections. And I didn't want to just be repeating whole sections of the song like I sort of did in previous tracks. So for this one, I kept the guitar and the descending synth line for these later sections, so that when I do repeat sections of the song, they could be similar, but still have that little extra thing alongside what they had before to keep them fresh. That's why I thought that the name of this track would make a good name for the name of this album. It's a track that I really like on this album, and it represents that simplicity. It's not a crazy track, it doesn't do anything insane, it takes little bits and pieces of melodies from other places and puts them together to make something new, and it's good. So sometimes in life you find yourself working at a sandwich shop, and sometimes you just gotta get a song in your head, write it down, and turn it into a track because, well, why not? I mean, you gotta put all the Backyardigans you watched growing up to good use, am I right? I mean, you gotta get something else out of that. I was a big fan of the Backyardigans. Had some good tunes. The intro for this track, I actually composed a lot after I composed the original melody. And I really like how it turned out. It was mostly just me messing with arpeggiators and how they could be equalized at different heights of the notes. And originally this was just a way to introduce the chords, introduce some of the bass before it went to the original melody that I wrote for this. But I actually really like how this intro turned out. It's very relaxing. Okay, so I know that I said that Out was the first melody I composed, but actually it was years earlier that I composed the melody for Thirds. I was just messing around with a pedal-powered organ at a relative's house when I played a melody, but then played the same melody alongside the third of each note, and that became the theme of this song, which plays one melody, then repeats that melody with the third included. An interesting part of this is that whenever both melodies are playing alongside each other, one melody will play in one ear and then the other will play in the other ear. And I'd heard that technique done before in previous songs, but once when I was listening to one of those previous songs, I was sharing an earphone with another person, and then I was like, wait a second, I'm only hearing half of the song here, and they're hearing another half of the song. That's kinda weird. So with that in mind, I came up with an interesting idea for this song. If you listen closely, the ear that is playing each part, either the above part or the below part, switches every 2 beats. So each ear will switch from playing the lower part to playing the higher part. So, and if you listen with just one headphone at a time, you'll hear this really clearly. I actually made an earlier version of this song using FL Studio years before I made this version in Ableton Live. So this was technically the first song I wrote on this album, but it was a lot different, it was a lot more rough, and the beat was clearly just MIDI the whole way through. Speaking of the beat, it is still MIDI for this, of course, but the original inspiration for this beat, I believe, was from a Mystery Guitar Man video called Teeny Joe Band, where he plays with his tiny little versions of himself. He plays Dixie. But the beat is just a really simple beatbox beat with like hi-hats in certain places, so that was the original beat for this, but then I took it, and when I made the Ableton version, I turned it into what it is now, which is sort of just this chilled out groove. Sometimes it seems with my songs, the question I'm trying to answer is how many melodies can I play at once and get them all to play nice with each other, and this song has like 3 different ones. Like now the intro melody is there with the thirds melodies, and I really like making multiple melodies play together. Inspired is a bit of a weird track, but it represents a very specific time in my life, which is actually also what the album art of this album represents. It was made during the time that I spent living in Vancouver. I moved there for a couple months to take a web development course, and I was living in this tiny little section of this 2-bedroom apartment place. And so I was just sort of in this cramped little place and in a totally new city where I didn't know anybody, and struggled to get my groceries back from the Costco because I didn't have a vehicle. But it was a wild experience. The melody I wrote here was reminiscent of the kind of song that I would sing back when I was a part of a youth choir back in high school. I produced this one very quickly. I didn't really overthink it too much like I did some of the other songs. I was just in Vancouver, booted up my computer, and was just like, alright, we got a simple chorus, we got some good verse sections, we're gonna have a solo and a bridge that'll tie it all together, and this is what it's gonna be. Once again, we see the return of some aspects that I had in previous songs. The beat is very reminiscent of the one that was in Land and Time. And we have the main melody mixing with its counter melody here during the chorus section, but it has that same happy feel as a lot of my other songs, and so I still like it for that same reason. And that brings us to the album art, which is one of the first pictures that I took on my phone when I went to Vancouver, because as anyone who's been to downtown Vancouver will know, there's this sort of dock area with all of these boats, and you can see all the buildings in the background. So I took a picture of that, and then what I did is I edited it so that the blue sky would be the opposite color of what it normally is, and the opposite of blue is orange. And since blue and orange are sort of my color scheme, I decided that this would make an interesting album art. And since the songs very much represent this point in my life, especially that time I spent in Vancouver, I decided it would make for a pretty good album art for this album. Once again, you can see some more similarities to Time in this one, like the way that we have the downbeats mixed with drum fills and the cymbals, the way that it hits on those downbeats. It's all very similar to what was in Time. I still feel like I don't have as much to say about this track as I do about some other tracks on this album. Since it took up less of my life actually making it, I just have one significant memory of me being in that place in Vancouver, listening to this track like, yes, you know what? This is good. I'm just gonna put it on there. I am satisfied with this. And so then I basically just moved on from it and went to the other tracks after that. Cordless is a track that I first came up with by just sitting in front of a piano and messing around with just the black keys. The black keys, they form a pentatonic scale, so you could basically just play random notes and it would almost always sound good. So I decided to see if I could come up with a full melody that only used black keys. And that ended up being the melody that you hear right now. Originally, this track was much slower, and it didn't have this same swing rhythm that it has now. I also didn't have any chords for it, so I would just repeat the tonic of the scale in almost like a bagpipe kind of way, and that's where the name of the song originally came from. That and the fact that the term cordless can also mean like wireless, which represents a kind of freedom. After I had the original melody, I came up with the counter melodies, the intro, and the verses. This portion of the melody is based off of the tune that is played on a lot of grandfather clocks, because growing up, one relative had one of these clocks that would just play this chime, and I would hear it as a child, and it never registered that it was the clock, because it wasn't like a classic grandfather clock where it has that chime that is very clearly coming from the clock. So for me as a child, it was just this thing that would just appear in the background, and I just randomly in the background I would hear do 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 do, and I was like, what is that? But I loved the sound of it. And what do you know? All of the notes fit a pentatonic scale, so I had to include it. Eventually I did find chords that fit the pentatonic melody well. So it's not actually a chordless song, but I mean, good luck making a song without any chords and making it sound good. Halfway through the song, the intro actually plays again, but it's been changed to fit the bass line. This strategy of keeping the feel and rhythm of a melody, but changing the notes to match a new set of chords, is actually one that I would continue to use in a lot of future projects. And for the most part, that's the album. It's not too long, and it keeps things simple. I think it still holds up pretty well, even though my production skills have changed quite a bit since I released it back in 2019. And now it is available to listen to on Spotify and other streaming platforms. You can also buy the tracks if you'd like, but if you'd rather download them for free, you can do so through Bandcamp as well. Also, feel free to use any of these tracks in your own content if you want to, just make sure to link back to the originals however you feel like doing that. And before I wrap this up, I would like to announce that tomorrow I will actually be releasing my second album, which I've been working on pretty much since I released this album, at least on and off. It's been a long time, but that one is going to have the most recent stuff I've worked on, and it's gonna be cool, so look out for that. Tomorrow I'll be uploading it on YouTube, and it'll also be available on Bandcamp and other streaming platforms like Spotify as well. So, thank you all for listening to me just randomly rant and talk about these songs that I've created and had a great time making. I hope you enjoy the next album. I hope you enjoy this album. I hope you enjoy your life. Making music doesn't have to be complicated, and you don't have to be good at it when you make your first project. You really just have to finish something and then put it out there. I think that's the first step, and that's what this project was to me. It was just the first thing that I could make, and so I'll continue improving over time with my future projects.